Patriots battling to break free from the colonial domination of English rule, the first 14 months of the War for Independence had gone well. After the outbreak of hostilities in April of 1775, the Americans had taken advantage of a smaller British force and had captured Fort Ticonderoga, pressured them out of Boston, and had nearly conquered Canada. By mid-1776, though, the tide of war had shifted. The largest British expeditionary force ever assembled up to that time arrived in America, and George Washington's Continental Army was pushed nearly to the breaking point. New York City fell to the British, along with New Jersey by year's end. However, Washington's famous counterattacks at Trenton, Christmas night 1776, and at Princeton, January 3rd, 1777, breathed new life into the cause of liberty. As the combatants prepared for the third year of war, Washington's challenge would be to prevent further British advances. Thus, the stage was set for the campaign of 1777. The British, from their base in Canada, launched an attack designed to isolate New England, while from New York City, another campaign targeted the Patriot capital, Philadelphia. But the attempt to isolate New England failed when in October, British General John Burgoyne was forced to surrender at Saratoga. Meanwhile, General Sir William Howe moved by sea to Maryland and marched northward toward Philadelphia. Attempting to stop the British advance, Washington was outmaneuvered and defeated at Brandywine on September 11th. British forces entered Philadelphia in late September. Washington tried to regain control of the capital with an attack at Germantown on October 4th. His troops, though courageous, were thrown back by the disciplined, experienced British. Their army intact and morale still high, the Americans retreated to a temporary camp at White Marsh. In early December, with the British in firm control of Philadelphia, Washington sought a winter encampment site which would allow him to watch the British, remain beyond reach of a surprise attack, and prevent the British occupation of Pennsylvania's richest farming region. Valley Forge was such a place, and on December 19th, 1777, the Army moved to winter quarters and began building their camp.
For the men of the Army, building the huts was a welcome relief from the waiting at White Marsh. It was something to do, a way to keep warm. The troops formed into 12-man squads, each to build its own living quarters. Tools were scarce, and timber had to be dragged to the hut sites. With one of every 4 men unfit for duty, construction proceeded slowly. General Washington, complaining about the shortages and their effects, wrote,
"We have, by a field return this day, made no less than 2,898 men now in camp unfit for duty because they are barefoot or naked."
Naked meant the soldiers' clothes were extremely ragged, or that their uniforms were totally inadequate. In spite of the obstacles, the work proceeded. Competition was encouraged between the squads. The $12 reward General Washington had offered for the first properly constructed hut in each regiment, and the desire to be under shelter, drove the builders. One cabin was completed by December 21st. And most men were under roof within a month. Colonel Timothy Pickering, writing to his wife on January 5th.
The huts are very warm and comfortable, being very good log houses, pointed with clay.
In a journal entry dated January 6th, Dr. Albigans Waldo, a surgeon with the 1st Connecticut Regiment, wrote,
"We have got our huts to be very comfortable and feel ourselves happy in them."
Though better than tents, the quality of the huts varied from squad to squad. Comfort was a relative thing, depending on where you found yourself, where you were from, and what you were used to. The 1st Connecticut was camped at the base of Mount Joy, along the inner defense line. Relatively well supplied with clothing by their home state, they were among the best equipped troops at Valley Forge. Just a half-mile west, the North Carolina troops were very poorly supplied and ranked among the worst equipped. Though the situation in each regiment varied, the troops were generally ill-equipped to deal with the harsh winter before them. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Carleton of Massachusetts stated,
"We have near 90 men in the regiment that have not a shoe to their foot, and near as many who have no feet to their stockings."
And an unidentified Rhode Islander complained,
Nakedness and misery our distressed troops and countrymen undergo at Valley Forge, whilst those of other states are much better provided for.
in spite of the shortages, each day had its duties and the activities of camp continued. The Valley Forge winter was generally moderate, though frequent rains and occasional snow persisted throughout the encampment. From reveille at dawn till tattoo after dark, the routine of winter grew tiresome for the cold, hungry troops. There were fortifications to be built, although shortages of tools and the need to complete winter quarters slowed progress. Wood had to be cut and fires continually fed. Pickets stood guard duty, and efforts to drill the troops continued. For some, foraging details could change the scenery and interrupt the monotony. Although there was a need to monitor British movements, most detachments leaving Valley Forge did so in order to gather supplies away from the immediate area of the encampment, which was already hard hit by the demands of feeding and housing so many men. Spurred by great need, foraging expeditions under General Anthony Wayne and General Nathaniel Greene achieved some success in procuring supplies, which included wheat, cattle, flour, and whiskey. Still, these efforts were hampered by problems the commissary itself continually encountered. Farmers and merchants with goods to sell frequently favored the British hard currency to the nearly worthless continental scrip. Too few wagons, poor communications, profiteering, and a woefully inadequate road system combined to interfere with the flow of supplies to Valley Forge. And so the encampment existed on a subsistence level. In a letter to Washington, General James Varnum of Rhode Island pointed out,
according to the sayings of Solomon, hunger will break through a stone wall. 3 days successively we have been without bread. 2 days we have been entirely without meat. The men must be supplied, or they cannot be commanded.
In the face of growing adversity, the men held on. As supplies fluctuated dramatically, an agonizing aspect of any day became waiting for the creak of an arriving wagon train or the bellow of cattle being driven into camp. In his diary entry for January 7th, Christopher Marshall recorded,
10 teams of oxen fit for slaughtering came into camp, driven by loyal Philadelphia women.
A little more than a month later, in a letter to his father, John Lawrence of South Carolina wrote,
We have lately been in a most alarming situation for want of provisions. Those who are employed to feed us, either for want of knowledge or for want of activity, or both, never furnish supplies adequate to our needs.
Most times from the middle of January on, the men could supplement their meager rations with purchases at one of the markets established in the camp. There, salt, vinegar, potatoes, or vegetables were available at fixed prices for those soldiers who had money. Quantities at the markets were limited, though, and often pay lagged. As Francis Dana, an observer, noted in February,
For flour they had not suffered, but upon an average, every brigade has been destitute of fish or flesh for days. We do not see from whence the supplies of meat are to come. The want of it will infallibly bring on a mutiny in the army.
fire cake, an abounding affection for their commander, and a healthy respect for the risks of desertion kept the Army together in its most difficult times. February was probably the worst month of the encampment. Plagued by disease, desertion, and expiring enlistments, the Army shrank from 12,000 to 6,000. Conditions and shortages combined to strain the already weakened force. Sickness reached epidemic proportions, fueled by poor sanitation and damp, overcrowded quarters. Serious ailments, typhoid, typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia, usually meant removal from camp. The Army, according to common practice, established hospitals outside the camp, some as far away as Ephrata, 30 miles distant. But many of the sick chose to suffer in silence rather than be transported to one of these general hospitals, separated from friends and familiar surroundings. Inadequate facilities and shortages of blankets and medicines hampered the efforts of dedicated doctors and surgeons. Local women and camp followers were recruited to help care for the sick in the hospitals. Washington, concerned as always with the welfare of his soldiers, wrote,
I sincerely feel for the unhappy conditions of our poor fellows in the hospitals. It is but too melancholy a truth that our hospital stores are exceedingly scanty and deficient in every way.
Mortality rates were high at the general hospitals. Many of the 2,000 men who died that winter did so at hospitals far away from the encampment itself. Doctors and surgeons were also hampered by a lack of medical knowledge. Antiseptic and anesthesia were unknown, and contagious disease was not fully understood. For every man killed in combat, roughly 10 died of disease. One of the few successes of the medical effort was the smallpox inoculation program that held that dreaded disease in check. The arrival of spring brought renewed hope to the camp. Morale among the troops rose. With Nathaniel Greene, newly appointed Quartermaster General, in firm control of the Quartermaster Department, and with roads and rivers becoming more passable, supplies flowed regularly. Increasing amounts of food, clothing, weapons, and equipment arrived in camp. As the weather warmed, activity in the camp increased. Units that had wintered elsewhere were recalled, and new recruits coming in raised the strength of the Army to nearly 20,000. In March, the retraining of the Army began in earnest under General von Steuben.
Take aim. Fire.
Upon his arrival in February, Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a former Prussian officer, had found an army without uniform training and lacking adequate discipline.
Shoulder, firelock.
Washington, recognizing Steuben's administrative talents, appointed him Inspector General, with the task of retraining the Army under one system.
Half-cock, firelock. Handle, cartridge.
Steuben developed that system, He wrote a simplified American training manual, expanded drilling, and began reshaping the Continental Army.
Charge with cartridge. Draw rammers. Ram down cartridge. Return rammers. Shoulder firelock.
Confidence and skill grew daily. News of the newly signed alliance with France further buoyed the spirits of the troops.
Firelock.
Exercise and fresh air were a welcome change from the dank, cramped cabins.
Firelock. Make ready.
Fortifications were complete. Drilling expanded. New weapons and equipment issued as Washington and his generals planned the Army's next move.
That move came on June 19, 1778, when the Continental Army, pursuing the British who had withdrawn from Philadelphia, marched out of Valley Forge. 9 days later, at the Battle of Monmouth in New Jersey, the British met a resupplied Continental Army, larger, better trained, and more unified than ever before. The Americans demonstrated the lessons learned at Valley Forge, and in the end, it was the British who were forced to withdraw. Bound by determination and training, a renewed Continental Army had taken the field with a spirit strengthened at Valley Forge. A spirit that would carry Washington's seasoned veterans 3 more years to victory at Yorktown in 1781 and beyond.